My name is Adam Lupel, IPI Vice President, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this policy forum on water, peace, and security to discuss a matter of survival. The report to the Global High-Level Panel on Water and Peace, chaired by His Excellency Mr. Danilo Türk, former President of Slovenia. Welcome to IPI, sir. We're grateful to have you. Allow me also to thank the Geneva Water Hub, where they go, for co-sponsoring today's event. Thank you for your partnership. It perhaps goes without saying, but water is a fundamental issue for all of us. Water connects, water divides. Bodies of water provide a gathering place, but they also constitute borders. Water sustains life, but it can also sweep life away. Understanding the balance between water's potential as either a source of conflict or an instrument of peace is increasingly recognized as critical to the future of the planet. This at a time when, by one measure, 2/3 of the world's population currently lives in areas that experience water scarcity for at least 1 month a year. No member state is completely immune to water challenges. Even this country, the United States, with its large rivers and more than 20,000 recognized watersheds, must regularly cooperate and coordinate with its neighbors, Mexico and Canada, on water-related issues. Good water governance requires cooperation, and this is indeed a matter of survival. For this, we are grateful that in November 2015, a group of 15 countries launched the Global High-Level Panel on Water and Peace with the goal of strengthening the global architecture to prevent and resolve water-related conflicts. And there is a clear need for this work. One statistic from the report that really jumped out at me was that out of approximately 400 internationally shared aquifers, only 5 have international agreements governing them. Much remains to be done. The need for greater attention to this issue was recognized by the Security Council in November 2016, when under Senegal's presidency, it organized its first ever thematic debate on water, peace, and security. And 2 of our panelists today were among the briefers. And then in June of last year, the Council held a high-level briefing under Bolivia's presidency on preventive diplomacy and transboundary waters. The final report of the panel that was recently published provides an invaluable resource from which to continue to advance discussions on this topic. It deserves attention, extensive attention here in New York and around the world, and thus I will say no more, because as you can see, we have a very distinguished panel to discuss all of this. And as I mentioned, we must conclude by 2:30 so that our panelists can keep their appointments across the street. You have complete bios in your handouts, but for the webcast, allow me to briefly introduce our speakers. Danilo Türk, who really needs no introduction in this community, is the chairman of the Global High-Level Panel on Water and Peace and served as the 3rd president of the Republic of Slovenia. And many in this room will remember him as Assistant Secretary General for Political Affairs under Kofi Annan. Mike Hammah is a member of the Global High-Level Panel and Government Minister for Land and Natural Resources of Ghana. He's held many positions in Ghanaian politics, including 16 years as Member of Parliament. Sandeep Waslekar is president of Strategic Foresight Group, a think tank based in India, and a senior research fellow of the Center for the Resolution of Intractable Conflicts at Oxford. Teresa Whitfield is director of the Policy and Mediation Division of the UNDPA. Before that, she was senior advisor to the president of Crisis Group and non-resident fellow at NYU's CIC. Francois Munger is the Swiss Special Envoy for Water and director of the Geneva Water Hub. Previously, he was chief of the Central America Water Program for the Swiss Agency for Cooperation and Development and senior water specialist at the World Bank. A lot of expertise and experience at this table, much to talk about. And with that, Mr. Türk, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Adam. And I wish to thank everybody for having come to this meeting in such a large number. It's wonderful to see so many friends in this room, and thank you, really, everybody, for coming. And I hope that our panel will convince you that we have to work together for improvement of water cooperation and making sure that water cooperation is used, as we say in our report, as an instrument of peace. Now, obviously, we have very little time for introductory remarks. I'm really very much looking forward to your questions. I assume that you have seen the report. If you haven't, please find it. It's easily found on the website of Geneva Water Hub. And this is a report which tries to look at the problem which I think has become fairly well known and is very often quoted in various pieces of literature, including, for example, in the definition of main risks for the future, which we read every year in Davos from the World Economic Forum. Water scarcity and water-related problems are defined as the third largest challenge for the future. And Adam already gave us some figures, which I'm not going to expand, except for one thing. Water scarcity is a growing problem. But it is also important to understand that the world has to find ways to produce 50% more food in the next 25 years and to double energy production at the time when the water is diminishing. Now, you can imagine that this is going to be a hugely important task. All these activities will require massive investment in water, and lack of proper organization and cooperation is likely to produce great instability, massive flows of people, and conflicts that can result from that. We have seen in Syria the developments that led to tensions and eventually war were visible, and people did understand them, but nothing was done on time. So a very large war has resulted, and this is the kind of scenario which we do not want to see repeated anywhere else. So this is the reality. Then the question is, how does one improve water cooperation? What does that entail? And our report tries to explain some of the forms and some of the time-tested forms of cooperation, such as water management arrangements in shared water basins. There are 286 shared water basins involving 146 states, but only 84 of those water basins have joint cooperation agreements. So there is a need to expand that and make this type of time-tested, historically known form of cooperation better, more effective. But this is not all. Of course, there are many other things that need to be done. In the United Nations, a variety of agencies are dealing with issues of water. There is a coordinating mechanism called UN Water, which tries to coordinate all these activities. But then it has to be understood that the international institutional landscape in this area remains painfully fragmented, and there is a need for much greater coherence and much more concentrated action. And our report gives some ideas about this, including on the questions of water monitoring, which obviously is always a problem when two or more states cooperate over a shared water basin. But then again, this has to be improved also at regional and global level. Much useful work is done through organizations like UNEP or the World Meteorological Organization, but more is necessary. There are other forms of cooperation which are important, including the work of international financial institutions. We, in our report, speak about mechanisms which can help, which do not necessarily require massive financial resources, but can improve the preparation of water cooperation projects, and that in turn would then create the possibilities to raise capital in private capital markets, something that is necessary to develop water cooperation further. And then obviously there are things which are more directly related to security issues, to security per se, more directly, and that is recognized quite broadly. If you read the speech that the Secretary General made at the Security Council meeting on 20 December last year, he spoke, and I quote, Water scarcity is a growing concern, and as demand for fresh water is projected to grow by more than 40% by the middle of century. So he identified this among the main challenges for the peace and security in the future. And he also emphasized in this speech that prevention must be at the center of everything that we do. Now, I hope that ideas like this will be taken seriously by the UN system and by member states more broadly. We have tried to test this possibility in an open debate in the Security Council in November 2016. I was one of the briefers of the Council. There were 70 member states participating, and they were generally very positive about the need to engage Security Council more directly in water-related issues in preventive mode, and of course in the post-conflict situations, in post-conflict peace building, where water also represents a very important task. Finally, and I will conclude with that, we in our report speak about the need to strengthen water diplomacy. We are talking about the need for a global observatory for water and peace, which would be a kind of a network type of international mechanism that would not necessarily work within the United Nations, but closely with the United Nations, and which will try to strengthen the cooperation and agency of all of those who are already active in this area and those who are likely to become active. Now, this is a kind of a very quick, very telegraphic overview of our report. I would again invite you to read it, to be inspired by it, and tell us what you think. Now, this is how the report looks for those who haven't seen it as yet. And it has a lot of interesting imagery and statistics, which I'm sure you will like. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for framing the issue and giving us those highlights from the report. And I second that it's really, really worth reading. And as I said, very much worthy of attention here and abroad. We will now turn to Mr. Mike Hammah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I probably would want to continue from where Chairman Danilo Türk left off, and to preface my submission by quoting from Kofi Annan, who comes from my country, and everybody knows about Kofi Annan. And he said, and I quote, "Fierce competition for fresh water may well become a source of conflict and wars in the future. But our water problems need not be only a cause of tension, they can also be a catalyst for cooperation. If we work together, a secure and sustainable water future can be ours." And I unquote. And that's for Kofi Annan. I mean, it was very prophetic in his submission. It's an undeniable fact that lack of safe, potable drinking water is not only a health issue, but a security and a developmental challenge as well, especially those of us who come from Africa. You understand, you know that Africa's economy is going through a bit of challenges, and it's important that Africa has to scale up its growth agenda. And to do that, we have to start from where we have the rare economic comparative advantage, and that's in agri, and gradually link agri to industry. Then once we link agri to industry, services come on board, and generally that's the economy. And in all this, you will recognize that water plays a very central role, because in agri, you're talking about needing water to irrigate the land. If you talk about industry, you need water to power the hydro dams and power generation energy, and water is needed in everything that we're going to do. So in Africa, water is a real challenge, and we need to be proactive. In Africa, we have to take deliberate and organized attempt to solve the problems that are likely to come up in future by taking action in the present. We need to be strategic. And as has already been seen, water can be a source of conflict or a source of peace. And I can give you some examples where water has been used to promote peace in the sub-region. The Senegalese Basin, for example, is a typical cooperation agreement, transboundary cooperation agreement, and it's working successfully. And as I speak, ECOWAS has put in place a mechanism, a permanent structure to ensure that all the transboundary rivers that run through ECOWAS, the ECOWAS region, have some sort of transboundary cooperation agreement. And it has started with what we call the Volta Basin Authority, and that is shared between Ghana, Burkina Faso, and Togo. And it's working perfectly. They have their offices in Burkina Faso, and it's based on the principle of the duty of cooperation and negotiation with a genuine intent to reach an agreement. It's also based on the duty of prior consultation. It's also based on the duty on the fact that all the riparian states understand that you do not have to do anything that will injure the use of the same water resources by your neighbors. So that provides a platform for the cooperation agreement. And they all understand that there has to be equitable utilization of the resources as it flows from one country downstream to the other country. So with the Water Basin Authority, as we speak now, it's functioning perfectly, and there are requests from countries to the water basins to ask for approval to develop specific projects and even joint projects. As I speak now in Ghana, we've put in a request for approval to develop 7,587 hectares of land for our, what we call commercial agricultural project. We're waiting for approval. We're also waiting for approval for us to rehabilitate an existing 1,853 hectares of irrigation land in what we call Pong area. That is also being looked at. And as we speak now, Ghana and Togo have also put in a request for a joint what they call execution of a project of a hydroelectric project at Douala. And that is also being assessed by the Water Basin Authority. So it tells you that with this kind of mechanism, a permanent structure in place, you realize that there's absolute peace between Burkina Faso, Ghana, and Togo. And the beautiful thing about it is that ECOWAS has taken it a step further and established what we call the West African Coordinating Council. And the key mandate of the West African Coordinating Council is to ensure the rationalization, harmonization of water policy throughout the entire West African region. As we speak now, they've come out with a West African Water Resources Management Policy Document 2008. They've also come out with a regional communication strategy, including a gender communication strategy for advocacy, sensitization, and educating the population basins for them to understand the need to cooperate to ensure that we can develop the basin. So I wouldn't want to bore you with a very lengthy talk, but the important thing is that clearly there's a well-defined structure in management of transborder water cooperation along the entire West African region. And we believe that we can replicate that in other regions in Africa. And to go together, Africa become more peaceful, there will be stability, and that is a sine qua non for sustained and accelerated economic growth. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for those concrete examples from Ghana and West Africa more broadly, which I think illustrate what I take to be the main point of the report, and that is that water problems do not have to be only a source of conflict, but rather a catalyst for cooperation, as you quote Kofi Annan. Thank you for that. Mr. Wasliker, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Adam, and it's a pleasure to be here at the IPI. The central message of the report of the Global High-Level Panel on Water and Peace is that transboundary water cooperation is not only good for good water governance and sustainable development, but it is also essential for comprehensive peace and political stability. And when I say comprehensive peace, I am referring to the factors which may have nothing to do with water. So water is really a catalyst for political dynamics which go well beyond the traditional consideration of water. And this is because if you look at all the 286 shared river basins in the world, which Chairman referred to, there is a very direct correlation between intensity and quality of cooperation and the risk of war. Any two countries which are engaged in politically driven, high quality cooperation do not go to war for any reason at all, whether related to water or not related to water. This is not to say that there is a cause and effect relationship. We are only saying that there is a correlation. Interestingly, if you look at the map of the world now, and IPI has expertise in this, there are approximately 22 countries or 22 pairs of countries which are facing war or risk of war today. And these are precisely the 22 countries which do not have, or 22 pairs of countries which do not have any water cooperation at all. But what is water cooperation? Water cooperation takes place at different levels. You can have technical cooperation with small exchange of data and some kind of a communication mechanism between the officials. That's water cooperation. Or you can have very high quality, politically driven water cooperation. Mike gave you examples from West Africa. He mentioned Senegal River Basin. In Senegal River Basin, the 4 countries that share the river have surrendered their national sovereignty over assets related to water to a joint commission. So hydroelectric dams, power stations, irrigation lines, navigation lines are not managed by the countries in isolation and not even owned by the singular countries. They are owned as a regional common or the joint property by the Senegal River Basin Commission. Similarly, in Gambia River Basin, which is next door to it, all water assets are jointly owned by the Gambia River Basin Commission. And then you go further to the east to Ghana, where Mike comes from, and the rivers there. Or if you go to Central America to the Trifinio plan in Central America, there the water assets are not jointly owned, but the countries are giving voluntarily a veto right to their neighboring countries on their plans for development to use those water resources. So these are the countries which voluntarily surrendering their sovereignty. It's impossible they would go to war. And at the other end, you have countries which think that water is such a security issue that, and even the water data is also such a security issue. They are living in an atmosphere of suspicion, so there is a high propensity of going to war. And you go on a whole ladder from zero water cooperation to the most active water cooperation in Senegal River Basin, and you see a direct correlation, an inverse correlation with the risk of war. Therefore, the Security Council, when it held 2 debates on water, one under Senegal's chairmanship in November 16 and in June under Bolivia's chairmanship, both the times the discussions were, the meetings were convened in the agenda item on preventive diplomacy and maintenance of peace and security. So basically, the Security Council signified that they're looking at water as an element for maintenance of peace and security. And I expect that this process will go on in future. And for it to go on, it's not Security Council and the member states that have to play a role, but it's a role, but it's a matter that we all have to consider, because as the report says in its title, water is a matter of survival. And why water is a matter of survival? Because I often quote that many times people say, is water the oil of the 21st century? And water is not the oil of the 21st century. Oil has alternatives like natural gas, solar energy, wind energy, bioenergy. The only alternative to water is water. And therefore, water is a matter of survival. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for adding further data to this point in the correlation between water cooperation and peace and security, that this is not just something that makes sense, but actually has the backing of real science and research. So much appreciated. Ms. Whitfield.
Thanks, Adam. Thank you, and it's very good to be back here at IPI as usual. I should emphasize that I'm the one person on this panel not associated with the panel on water and peace, and therefore I can safely say that I am the person who knows the least about water in any form on the panel. I'm nonetheless extremely glad to be here, and we had within DPA the privilege of a couple of hours of informal exchange with the panel members and other colleagues here yesterday, which was very interesting and productive. I'm pleased to be here because from where I sit, working with DPA, thinking about conflict. Sorry, is that better? Oh, I thought the mic was on. Okay. I'm sitting from where I sit in DPA, thinking about conflict prevention, thinking about conflict resolution. I had a division which works on mediation support. We've long had in the standby team of mediation advisors expertise on natural resources. It's obvious that we should be thinking now and thinking much more than we have been about interconnections between our work, climate change, natural resources, and water specifically. So I welcomed the publication of the report, which I read, and from my objective, ignorant perspective, can say it's well worth reading and very easy to read. And I welcome thinking about follow-up. We and I can also say with a sort of sense of honest self-reflection, it's an area where I don't think we within DPA do enough work, but we are rapidly and consistently reaching out to others. That isn't to say we've done nothing. We have had a long and fruitful dialogue and partnership with what is now, I'm instructed, not UNEP, but United Nations Environment. We published a couple of years ago and worked the very important work towards the publication guide on natural resources and mediation. We're also working with UNEP in support, United Nations Environment, in support of the African Union, the new panel on the WISE, helping them think through how to engage more on natural resources in some of their conflict mediation and prevention efforts, and a part of a new partnership of looking at women, peace, security, and national resources with UNDP, UN Women, PBSO, and UN Environment. Practically, we had in the early days of the standby team, it was from the beginning, the standby team had a natural resources expert, but we struggled a little bit because natural resources expertise is so broad and the kinds of expertise that you need is so specific that one person wasn't really suited to doing everything, and then we weren't actually finding that much demand at that point on requests. So we moved to a model where we have a number of natural resources experts on our kind of roster who can be drawn on for different and quite specific needs. We've been most consistently engaged in Central Asia, which comes as no surprise. Water diplomacy in Central Asia is a critical issue, and just this morning the Secretary General and the Security Council was speaking very positively about the changes he found in the region during his recent visit there, and it was something we discussed yesterday as well. Moving forwards, I think we need to be thinking very much about partnerships, particularly if, as I say, you come from DPA where you know these huge issues are out there, but you're not the institutions or the people with either the data or the technical expertise. We can do what we can in terms of our own kind of expertise that we draw on for mediation support, but we are also looking towards deepening partnerships with other entities of the UN, with civil society actors, and many of them represented or in the kind of broader network of the community of entities that were consulted and that the international panel draw on. It's an incredible resource. With member states, of course, and with other actors as we move forward. So I'm not really going to say much more than this. I know that time is really short and that there is we want to leave time for questions, but I just think it's something. This is an area where, looking forwards, it is both a clear threat in terms of conflict prevention when we look at the broader climate change data and what the projections forward are for water. It's also an opportunity where, from a political perspective, when we look at conflicts where water is engaged, what is usually very hard is the fact that water is rarely a standalone element. There are many of the big conflicts where water, obvious one would be the Nile Basin. You have questions of water and boundary use tangled up with broader geopolitical concerns, and as a kind of chicken and egg in terms of not just that conflict but others, is questions to be asked is do water and other issues of natural resources, the resolution of those conflicts have such obvious benefits for the population in those regions, do they provide a way in? do they provide a way in when geopolitics might otherwise be stuck, because they can lead to win-win solutions? Or in some places, do you have to come at it from the other way, and that you can only actually get the water and natural resources through going in through the geopolitics? That's at the macro level. Another area where, and I'll finish with this, that's a priority for us moving forward is work we're doing from within the mediation support unit in terms of supporting and working with our partners in the UN in field operations and elsewhere towards much more work on local and community level conflicts. It is, I don't need to go into any detail on this, but it's very clear that many of those conflicts have natural resources, in some cases water, as an element within them. So this is another area where we see a huge and important and fruitful area of work moving forwards. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Teresa. Thank you for that view from DPA and the need to do more on the connections between conflict, climate change, natural resources, water in particular, and then the big issue of the connection with the geopolitical challenges that we're facing, and the importance of partnerships and the local level moving forward. So thank you very much for those insights. Mr. Munger, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. We highlight that water is certainly one of the key challenges of this century. We also highlight the high risk of a global water crisis, but the cooperation is the center of our report. And for example, in Syria, where it's obvious water is a weapon used by different parties, in Syria, on the Oronte River, we have evidence of some nucleus of NGOs that start to rebuild the system for the reconstruction. We have definitively to take advantage of these forces and these tools that water is in terms of cooperation and peace building. In the case, the most perhaps advanced case of cooperation is certainly the Senegal River Commission that Sandeep already mentioned. In Senegal River, in this area, they had a conflict, a solid conflict, strong conflict between Mauritania and Senegal. They cut all the relation between the two countries, minus the relation in the Senegal River Commission. Why? Because it's an architecture where the country owns the depths, but the infrastructure is a commune infrastructure of the basin. So you can cut the relation, but you will not have influence on the management of the infrastructure. So it's an example, and the Commission has been certainly a key for the peace building between these two countries. But you imagine this requires a solid architecture. And for this, the panel recommends to create a safe space at the early, for the early preparation of the project. The banks are not very well equipped to prepare projects with cooperation. So for this is one of the solid recommendations of the panel. This said, we have a lot to do. And you already mentioned the case of the aquifers. It's true, we have just 5 transboundary aquifers with an agreement. But the aquifer is 90% of our capital on fresh water available. This means that it's a very serious issue. And in general, the data is a weakness. We have conflict, we have tension, but without data. So data sharing is also part of the cooperation. Yes, with this, I would like to finalize my point. Perhaps just an aspect, you can download the document on the Secretariat and on the Geneva Water Hub. This document is translated in French and in English. We will have a translation very soon in Spanish, and we expect one in Russian and in Arabic. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for further information about the work of the Geneva Water Hub and the report, the recommendations, and for looking at the contrast between when Syria, where water is used as a weapon, Senegal River Cooperation is used as a catalyst for cooperation. We've got a good 35 minutes for Q&A, and the floor is open. I've got one way in the back to start.
Thank you. Richard Jordan from International Council for Caring Communities. Thank you to all the presenters. With a question for a long-standing friend, Danilo Türk. The UN World Tourism Organization has a network of global observatories on sustainable tourism that are anchored in academic universities. How would you envision the proposed observatory that you referred to working with academia? Thank you.
And we'll gather several questions, and then we'll come back to the panel. And here in the second row, John Hirsch.
Thank you very much. I'm with IPI. First of all, thank you all. Teresa, in particular, with all of you, I have a question about your relationship with the African Union. Paul Kagame is about to take over as the head of the Assembly. And there was a big piece by a crisis group this week about the 7 primary challenges facing the African Union in their analysis. Water is not mentioned. Not mentioned. So they mentioned conflicts, particularly in South Sudan, Somalia, and the Central African Republic, and they mentioned rather broadly development. So my question is whether yourself or the Secretary General or others are in contact with President of Rwanda, Mr. Kagame, and Faki Mahamat, the head of the peace and security apparatus there, whether you're going to bring, and will water be a factor in resolving conflict or simply something that will have to wait until those conflicts can be resolved in those countries that I've mentioned and others? Thank you.
Great. Yes, back here in the...
Hi, thank you. Neela Malwani from the Dutch Mission. My question is for all the panelists. There was mention of work done in the Security Council and open debates and briefings on water. How do you see the role of the Security Council in the future with regard to this issue? And what's the role of the UN also in facilitating that?
Great, I think that puts a fair amount on the table. We'll come back to the panel, and then we'll have another round of questions.
Well, I'm sure that all of us will have something to say in response to the questions that were asked. Let me start by quickly responding to, making comments on all 3 questions that have been asked. Well, of course, we see the Global Observatory for Water and Peace as a network, as a system that connects better, in a more effective way, the existing capacities. There is capacity in many places, including, of course, in the academia. There are several universities in various parts of the world, in the United States, very prominently, in Europe, in China. I was in Beijing recently and have discussions with experts in China, and they are doing really excellent work relevant to the parts of Asia where China has developed its policies in the past period and will continue in the future. So we can see clearly the academic element very strongly represented in that communication. Now, of course, the difficult question is, how does one link the existing knowledge and existing academic work with practical policy making? And there, obviously, such a center, which I guess will start from Geneva, but will include actors in all parts of the world, will have the main emphasis of its work. I, of course, cannot predict how exactly that will look, but of course it will be policy-oriented and will work with states members of the United Nations, with other policy-relevant actors. And we have been, for example, earlier this week in the World Bank, we talked to the Vice President of the World Bank and officials in the IFC to see what exactly is necessary to prepare water cooperation projects in a way which makes them bankable and therefore sufficiently well financed. I mean, there seems to be a lack there. There seems to be a shortage of effort and also imagination. We, as you can see, have very strong cooperation with Switzerland, with Swiss government and Swiss experts who are globally known for their financial expertise. And we are working with global financial actors to provide advice that would help in that regard. And some of the ideas are also explained in the report, which you will see. So networking and energizing the work of policymakers, academia, financial sectors is something that needs to be strengthened. Now to John Hirsch, I would say, obviously, we have worked in Africa initially through the West African lens. I mean, Senegal has been very active on our panel. Mike Hammah is coming from Ghana, and he has been a very important agent of African questions in the work of our panel. We are planning to have contacts with the African Union, and obviously we'll look into this question quite seriously. Now, of course, there is a network of water basins in Africa, and there is a lot of discussion in every part of Africa. We have to figure out which are the immediate priorities nowadays. There has been important developments relating to Congo River, and Sandeep can say perhaps more about that because he was involved in Congo Basin himself. So I believe that our team will have opportunities to help. To the question of the role of the Security Council, as you will see from the report, we are suggesting a series of elements of a possible resolution of the Security Council because we believe that on situations that are on the agenda of the Security Council, the Council should develop its mandate relating to the protection of civilians in armed conflict much further, and that water element should be there. You find references to water installations and water resources in several Security Council resolutions already. So the understanding of importance of this aspect is growing, but we believe that the time is coming when a more comprehensive approach is necessary. Security Council is a body with formidable powers, and although we cannot expect, of course, automatic results, it is very important how the policy orientation that the Security Council provides is designed, and we would like that to happen. So in the report you will see specific elements that we are making, and this is not the time to go into much detail, but in the report you will see that.
Mike, would you like to respond to that? Yeah? Okay.
As Danilo said in response to Nina Balani from the Dutch mission, the report has very detailed proposals for the consideration in the context of the agenda of the Security Council. But one underlying message there is a question whether the Security Council should recognize water as a strategic asset of humanity. It can be coined in different ways, but this is the substance of the message. If this recognition is granted as a strategic asset of humanity, then a number of specific measures will follow, and they are there in the report. On another question, I think raised by John Hirsch or someone else, on the relationship between water and peace or conflict, what happens first? Is water the entry point of dialogue? Or do you already, for peace, or do you already need to have peace? This is an interesting question. We have studied it closely while providing research support to the panel. And if you can imagine the visual of a DNA, the double helix DNA inside the cell of our body, water and peace relationship is exactly like a double helix DNA. So there is one thread is the water, the other thread is peace. As in the case of DNA, you don't know which thread begins first. Similarly, in the case of relationship between water and peace, you don't know which thread begins first, but it is entangled. That is for sure. So sometimes it may begin with confidence building over water in a conflict situation, and then you build peace, and then you go back to water, and then you build peace. And sometimes you first create a peace agreement, and you consolidate that peace agreement with cooperation in water. Danilo comes from Slovenia, as you all know. And after the Dayton Agreement, the very first agreement which was signed by the former Yugoslav states, I was expecting him to mention it, but he's too polite, was the Sava River Agreement. That was the first agreement signed by the countries in the region. So they have the Dayton Agreement, which created peace. Now, that quality of peace in Dayton is a matter of separate debate. I'm not going to get into that. But you had some peace there. And then you had the Sava River Agreement. And then once the Sava River Agreement was there, you had other measures to build a political cooperation. In the case of Central America, a lot of you are young people here in the audience. You may not remember, but there are old people like John Hirsch and Michael Doyle and myself. Danilo is in the young category. We remember the famous 1985 peace agreement in Central America initiated by Oscar Arias. Now, until 1985, all Central American countries were fighting with each other for every possible reason that they could conceive. And then Oscar Arias introduced the Central American Peace Plan. And after that peace plan established the peace in Central America, immediately it was followed by a water cooperation agreement. And then there was another peace plan and another water cooperation agreement. And this has been going on for the last 20 years. And the last, I would conclude with the good news. When we talk about the Middle East, we only hear about crisis and conflict and problems and violence and blood. But in the last 2 years, in the middle of all this, Iraq and Turkey have entered into, I would not say a treaty, but something less than a treaty, over the management of Tigris River. So there is a strong understanding developed through a formal intergovernmental protocol signed by the two ministers on 15th of March 2017, so less than a year ago, on certain specific measures for managing Tigris River, including the controversial Ilusu Dam. And 1 month ago, a team from the government of Iraq went to Ilusu Dam at its site at the invitation of the Turkish authorities, saw the design there, and 2 days ago, the Turkish authorities decided to postpone the filling of the dam till June. So here you have a situation where in a vast conflict environment, a water cooperation process, I would not say agreement, has been initiated, and hopefully that leads to peace.
Thank you. Fortunately, I'm no longer at Crisis Group, or I would have been responsible for clearing that statement, which I haven't read yet. But I can say I was in Addis a few months ago for the launch of the new Panel of the Wise and the meetings of FemWise, and there was an event with Musa Faki and others. And I came away from it with the clear sense that natural resources was at the very top of the agenda in terms of thinking in preventive terms. I mean, the issues that came back to again and again: natural resources, greater involvement of women, not surprisingly, as it was there was a couple of day events and FemWise was being launched, and attention to youth moving forward. But natural resources was right up there, which is entirely unsurprising. I think the UPSALA conflict data has something, 14 conflicts since 1990 in Africa, which are either financed or connected to natural resources, and within that, water is very real. Similarly, I think, I'm not going to speak for the Secretary General, but we only have to look at what he's said and the way he has a kind of holistic approach to thinking about prevention, not just conflict prevention, but prevention of all kinds of other things. And he, in the December speech, the Security Council talked about climate change as a threat multiplier. And I know he looks at conflict from a holistic perspective and is very aware. Partly he's a real data geek. If you've been in, those of you who've been in meetings with him where data comes up, you see his eyes light up. And I have been in briefings, for example, a briefing from the WMO to the Secretary General, and he is acutely aware of resources as a threat going forward. Just on the Security Council, Danilo and others will have a much better sense of what the Security Councils should or could be doing moving forwards. But I actually think the the debates over the last couple of years, the work of Senegal, the work of Bolivia, have been extremely positive in bringing this issue onto the agenda and forcing the rest of us to shape up. Thanks.
You said you had a quick intervention for it.
Well, Sandeep referred to my politeness, and I take this to be a kind of praise. Of course, he very well explained the importance of Sava River Agreement. What I would like to add is that obviously we are discussing something that has long history. We are talking about water cooperation, which is really a very old concept. Every major peace agreement in Europe included water cooperation clauses. And now we have to think about this. Is it so that people need war in order to come to the conclusion that water cooperation is good? Or can water cooperation become a subject for preventive action? And that is why I'm so happy that the Secretary General, when he defined his approach to peace and security, speaking to the Security Council, said prevention must be at the center of everything we do. We have to be acutely aware of the challenges, and of course they have to be addressed in a preventive mode. We have now a number of arrangements which can be a great source of inspiration for the future. The cooperative agreements do exist. We also have experiences with those efforts in the past which were inspired by the same preventive philosophy but did not succeed. Our panel had one of these sessions in Amman, Jordan. We talked to the water experts from the region. And they told us that the most impressive effort in the region was Eric Johnston's plan from 1956, an American water engineer appointed as water ambassador by President Eisenhower, who provided a regional plan for Jordan River, essentially. But now, given that all these things did not work for various political reasons, they come again and again to the conclusion that a regional Middle East arrangement on water cooperation would be very necessary for the future. Perhaps when the war in Syria ends, we will see water cooperation clauses involved one way or another between Turkey and Syria, Turkey and Iraq, within Syria itself. And I believe that, if nothing else, I mean, the post-war arrangements should be seen as preventive instruments to make the relapse into war less possible. So that's
great. Thanks, Francois. If you don't mind, I'm going to go back to the floor for another round of questions. Then we'll come back, and I'll come back to you first on the next round. Coming back to the panel. Okay. I've got Michael Doyle here, and Mel, and then Alex.
Hi, Michael Doyle with Columbia University and IPI. I was waiting for President Türk to put on his professor's hat, which you just did a moment ago. I'm in my class this week. We're doing the Treaty of Westphalia, and one of the things in that agreement that surprises our students the most are the water clauses for the Rhine River. So this has an old history. But my question, and I've had a chance to skim but not read carefully the report, do you introduce, let's call them global principles that should shape water agreements? Or are they left regularly to ad hoc arrangements which any two parties should make? I mean, to be more practical, do you have principles of distribution other than sovereignty and riparian principles so that population or GDP should enter into normative principles of how the water should be distributed? Or do you think that should be just left case to case to case and bargaining? So is there a chapter on the grand principles for how water should be shared in your report as a way to reduce long-run conflict?
Here in the second row.
Thank you. My name is Mel Duncan from Nonviolent Peace Force. As Adam mentioned in his introductory remarks, there are major water disputes that are happening in the United States. One of the most prominent was at Standing Rock, Sioux Nation last year, where the Standing Rock indigenous tribe tried to defend the Missouri River from the imposition of an oil pipeline. They were met by massive militarized police force. Have you envisioned a role that the observatory could play, that the Security Council could play, that other UN entities could play in disputes like this that take place actually between sovereign nations, because Standing Rock is a sovereign nation. What role could happen for that situation?
Great, and yeah.
Sure. My name is Alexandra Hinneker, and I'm with the New York City Mayor's Office for International Affairs. And my question is a sort of a follow-up on roles that different actors can play. You may or may not know that New York City grapples with these same questions of water management and cooperation within our city that you're talking about here on the international level. So I was pleased to see in the report that you talked about local engagement and you highlighted it as one of the priorities. But I didn't really hear you reflect it in your comments today. So I was wondering if you could go into a bit more detail about what the role of local authorities could be in your work.
Take one more question before. Yeah, was there? Sorry. Oh, that's sorry. Yeah. Great.
Hi, I'm Dr. Sat Bhattacharya from Sloan Kettering Cancer Center and a couple of nonprofits in education that had launched. This is just a comment. Among other things, for the last 5 years, I've been developing an animation film on climate change, but from 10,000 years of human history to present times, including all the climatic conditions that have changed over time. And water obviously plays a central role from the beginning of time to the present times, as many of you have rightly addressed. This film also can be used as a education tool, not just for New York City and other school systems, but at all levels of government and other things. And I think water, peace, and civilizations should be the central theme, how we should be addressing basic humanity. And I guess it has to be taught right from the school level, middle school and upwards, so that it can be properly addressed when these children grow up as mature adults. That has to be the intervention at levels where they are retooled with our environment.
Great, thank you. I'd rephrase that. The question is the role of education in the project. Very good. We'll come back now to the panel for responses to the questions and any final remarks. Francois, the floor is yours.
Yes, perhaps an answer. Sorry. An answer, or part of an answer to your question, and Danilo will certainly go more in detail. I think the international water law give a good frame to the equity, to the how to manage water. This said, we spend a lot of time with the concept of integrated water resource management, where we have allocation of amount of water. And, for example, in the Senegal River Commission, there's a big difference. That is not an allocation of water, it's an allocation of benefits, share benefits. And this is a big advance in terms of the water management. And I think it's something that now we have to take really seriously. And in particular, it's perhaps easier with the energy and the hydropower. And of course, we need water for agriculture, etc. But for hydropower, you can really share the benefit and to position the dams in the better situation, not in a situation which is a negotiation between the allocation of water.
Yep.
Well, I'd like to comment on the questions which were raised, and first start with Michael's questions about the global principles. Obviously, there is global water law. There are two conventions, the Water Convention of 1997, the use of, the non-navigational uses of water, and that contains certain basic principles: fair and equitable use of shared water resources, and do no significant harm. These are the two critical principles. And it was quite interesting when we had the discussion in the Security Council to listen to statements from various member states. Now, obviously, upper riparian countries would normally emphasize the first principle, fair and equitable use, and lower riparian countries would use the second principle, would emphasize the second principle, do no major harm. And now, of course, the big art of diplomacy is how does one reconcile the two? Luckily, the international community has developed mechanisms through the UN Economic Commission for Europe, which has produced a convention on water cooperation, which is now open to all member states of the United Nations since a year ago. A year and a half ago, and we hope that that mechanism will be used, and it contains a number of procedural devices, consultative mechanisms, the potential, the mechanisms that could make those basic principles work in specific situations. So one of the things one has to emphasize when talking about the future of water cooperation is let's use what already exists in terms of principles and mechanisms. They are not fully utilized, that could be better utilized, and this is something that we could very easily discuss in any part of the world. We were in Washington earlier this week. We talked with the friends in the OAS. They have a big program in that regard, and they are very interested in figuring out how that sort of, the mechanisms that exist, how can they be put to use in various specific situations in the region. Now, 3 questions were asked relating to situations on water which are happening within the confines of a single member state of the United Nations. Let me put that definition. Now, of course, beneath the level of single state sovereignty, which is the criterion for membership of the United Nations, there are many entities, many levels of social organization, and many actors. We have a chapter on this in our report, which consists of the following words: people's diplomacy, intersectoral water management, and decision making. So we see a case for what we call people's diplomacy. Diplomacy shouldn't be left only to state representatives, but also beneath states there are elements that in fact use techniques which are similar to diplomacy. Obviously, there are certain aspects of policy making at the level of nation states which are special. Our panel is an international panel, and we don't want to create an impression that we are enemies of state sovereignty. Not at all. We are in favor of state sovereignty, which has to be used in a constructive and responsible way, a responsible exercise of sovereignty. Now, that includes the need for the state to provide an appropriate legal framework, and we have, again, the inspiration from international principles that can be used in national legal systems. We have mechanisms at the international level which can be adjusted to the needs within states, and we have something which we emphasized in the report as a potential instrument, and that is the Global Compact that Michael is very familiar with, that Kofi Annan formulated some 15 years ago, and now already includes several 10,000 businesses. Now, it has a water mandate, the Global Compact. And obviously, there is a possibility to use that instrument differently, more effectively. I'm not saying that this answers all the questions or that this solves all the problems, but this is an instrument which has to be used more fully. Now, there may be other instruments, and in our report we also say what are the basic needs for states to provide. I mean, legal framework, solid scientific analysis, which is basic for any problem solving, any solution seeking, and other things like this. But again, it comes to people's diplomacy, intersectoral management, and policy making. Water management is a matter of governance and policy making, and that's a complex process.
Great, thank you. Yep, great. Okay, Mike, please.
Thank you. I just want to continue from where Daniel left off. In Africa, when I spoke about the Volta Basin Authority, which is more permanent structure for the management of the water resources between Burkina Faso, Ghana, and Togo, I did indicate that it was based on the fundamental principles. One, the duty of cooperation and negotiation with the genuine intention to reach an agreement. There was also a duty of prior consultation amongst the riparian states. Then there was also a duty to ensure that you do not injure the use of the water resources by your neighbor downstream. So it's very clear. And there was also another fundamental principle of ensuring that there is equity in the utilization of the water resource. This is the basic principles that all the riparian street countries agree on to form the basis for the Transboundary Water Cooperation. So as I speak now, the Water Basin Authority is in place, and that has to be replicated along the other riparian rivers. One has to do with the Tano River, and the second had to do with the Oti River. With the Tano and the Oti River, the legal and then the institutional capacity framework is being developed along the lines of the Water Basin Authority. And recently, you will realize that Ghana had a bit of problem with our neighbors, Ivory Coast, when the water upstream, that's the Tano River, was being polluted by illegal mining taking place in Ghana. The new government took over, and the first thing the new government did was to issue a policy statement to ensure that mining, whether small-scale mining, whatever form it takes, is at least is stopped, or they place a moratorium on that to ensure that there has to be reviewed. And moving forward, we make sure that the actors who are involved do the right thing. The good thing about it is that even though there was not a permanent structure on the Tano River, as far as Ghana's relationship with Ivory Coast on transboundary cooperation was concerned, Ivory Coast agreed that, look, we'll wait for you to do something about it. So the two countries put together a joint committee, and they had a limited bilateral arrangement to say that we are going to cooperate to help you to ensure that at least you can solve the problems with legal mining along the Tano River. We are not going to make much. And as I speak now, most of the Ghana rivers are now, they are pure. You can fetch water and drink straight from water. And so why wouldn't we replicate the same thing on other rivers? So I'm saying that there's a bright light at the end of the tunnel, and then we are starting from the known to the unknown. It's worked beautifully with the Water River Basin, and we are going to go through Tano. We call it the Komi, Tano, and then the Oti River, which is also on the pipeline. There's also the Mono River in Togo, which is also being considered. And there is the final one that the Water Resources Coordinating Center under the ECOWAS is looking at, is what we call the Kavi, Sesto, and Sassandra rivers. That's Guinea, Ivory Coast, and then Liberia. These are also on the drawing board, and then they are looking at it. So there's really a bright light at the end of the tunnel. Thank you.
Great. Sandeep, you have the final word from the panel.
The fact that Mayor of New York has an Office of International Relations signifies a major shift in the theory and practice of international relations. Across the street, you have the United Nations. And in the 1940s, the UN, the Bretton Woods Agreement, which created the World Bank and the IMF, they were all creations of the states. It was impossible to imagine that anybody but the states would create institutions of international governance. And now we are living in a world where mayors, NGOs, civil society organizations, and even a panel like this, which is an independent body, though directing its messages to the UN system and to the states, but still an independent body with a really independent chairman. I know him too well. So is also a testament to the shift that's taking place in the practice of international relations. So at this time, when a new world order is emerging, new world in a sense, a world which is not based on the monopoly of the state construct, but a world which is in a way little bit more opening. Local organizations, mayors' offices, they all have opportunities to contribute to better governance of water, better governance of climate, better governance of migration, and all critical humanitarian issues that we face. But at this time, also, I would like to say that we have to learn from best practices in different parts of the world. Earlier, learning from best practices was always the African, Asian, Latin American institution learning from Europe and North America. But now we can all learn from each other. So Mayor of New York can perhaps find Mayor of Singapore, which is excellent example of very competent management of water resources, and find solutions to your problems. And across the Atlantic, you have European Union. And what's happening in the European Union? Brexit. Britain is leaving by next year, and everything else will be negotiated. But there is one thing where whole this Brexit negotiations is going to be caught into a big tunnel. And that is the entire relationship between Britain and Ireland is managed through EU. There is no bilateral commission like that so many of the commissions that Mike mentioned. And so once Britain leaves EU, there is no way, there is no mechanism to manage the relationship with Ireland. And so Britain then and Ireland should probably go to Ghana and learn how to manage bilateral relationships and construct bilateral institutions. So we are living in a world where the power is shifting from states to a more wider area of actors, but not not overstaking it. We have to recognize the centrality of the states. And we are living in a world where north, south, south, north, east, west, west, east, everybody has to learn from each other. And so long as we have the humility to recognize this reality, so long as we have the depth to understand the changes which are taking place, I think we can all work together to shape a better world order, whether for water or for anything else. Thank you, and thank you, IPI.
Good. Great. I think I will not add anything to that except to say thank you so much. It's been a fascinating discussion. I promise IPI will remain engaged in this issue, and I know you will too. So thank you really very much. Thank you.